One of the things I do with my students, they know the Christmas story, the wise men, and you get the shepherd, have them read Matthew, and just make a list of what happens in Matthew. This.
I don't know who this person is, but I have a feeling I'm not going to like him.
Yeah.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today, it's two former Christians, as I'm joined again by world-class, renowned scholar of the Bible, Dr. Bart Ehrman.
Yeah, who is this person?
This is Tim Barnett.
This is Red Pen Logic with Mr. B, where we help you assess bad thinking by using good thinking, and we have way too much fun.
Now, I used to be a full-time high school science and math teacher, okay? So this is what we did. We would take the pen and correct students' work. And it wasn't to put the student down. No, I wanted to help the student think more clearly.
Okay, well, I'm always happy to be corrected.
Well, that's good, because last year you did some Christmas-themed interviews, like the ones with Alex O'Connor and Michael Shermer, and some evangelicals like Tim had some notes for you.
Okay. So if he says something that really upsets me, I can pause it.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
You can
All right.
pause, take a breather. We're all good. Yep.
Okay, all right, okay.
One of the things I do with my students, they know the Christmas story, the wise men, and you get the shepherd, have them read Matthew, and just make a list of what happens in Matthew. This. Then I have them read Luke and make the same list for Luke. And is there anything that cannot be reconciled? It blows their minds. You realize, whoa, after Jesus is born, Mary has to make an offering in the temple. And then they go straight back to Nazareth, which is about 100 miles to the north up in Galilee. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is born, and Joseph is warned that Herod is now going to try and kill the child. And so Joseph takes the family and goes down to Egypt, and they stay there till Herod dies. When they hear that Herod dies, they come back. They can't resettle in Bethlehem like they want. They resettle in Nazareth. If Matthew is right that they went down to Egypt for months or years or however long, how can Luke be right that they immediately returned to Nazareth?
And what is the answer to that question from
I
the
don't
perspective
know.
of a Christian?
I don't know. I mean, you have to make something up.
In this video, New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman offers Alex O'Connor an example of what he believes to be an irreconcilable contradiction in the Christmas accounts. Now, before we look at the specific supposed contradiction, let me make a general observation. Many alleged Bible contradictions arise from applying unnecessary assumptions or false expectations to the Bible. In many cases, the alleged contradiction stems from the reader misunderstanding or even misrepresenting the author's original intent.
I'm looking forward to finding out how he knows what somebody's intentions are. In other words, like right now, suppose somebody tried to explain what my intention was in doing this interview with you. They might have some guesses, but I can tell you they've got no idea. I've got things in my head right now that they would not guess about why I'm doing this interview. And so that's me with somebody you're talking to now. If you're talking about an author who lived 2,000 years ago, we don't know what his name was. We don't know where he lived. We don't know his educational background. We don't know anything about his life. And we're going to now learn what his intention is. Okay, good luck with that. But bring it on.
Let me show you what I mean. Ehrman challenges his students to read the Christmas accounts in Matthew and Luke and make a list of events for each. What you will find is some similarity, like Jesus being born in Bethlehem, of a virgin, and after his birth returning to Nazareth. But you will also find differences, like the Magi and the trip to Egypt in Matthew, and the shepherds and the trip to the temple in Luke. While Matthew and Luke give some different details, it's not clear that this amounts to a genuine contradiction. Here's why. For this to be a genuine contradiction, the reader must assume two things. First, they assume that silence about an event is denial of an event.
So, first of all, is there such a thing as a genuine contradiction?
There is, and he's absolutely correct so far, that if two stories simply have different details, that's not a contradiction. And so if one story has the wise men and the other has the shepherds, that's not a contradiction. You have temple versus Eve. That in itself is not a contradiction. So he's absolutely right about that. And if he accuses me of taking that stand, then he doesn't know what I'm talking about.
True, Luke doesn't mention the trip to Egypt, but what follows from that? The answer's simple. Nothing. Luke's silence is not a denial. Now I know what you're thinking, but Tim, Luke says when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned into Galilee to their own town of Nazareth. There it is. Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Nazareth. This leads to the second assumption. Second, the reader assumes Luke's describing immediate consecutive events. Luke does say that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus returned to Nazareth, and it says that it was after making sacrifices for ritual purification in Jerusalem. The question is, was it immediately after or eventually after?
So I think he's saying that I'm assuming something. I mean, it sounds like he's assuming that actually what Luke meant is that they did the sacrifice in the temple, then they went down to Egypt, and then they came back. And so why is that not the assumption? So, I mean, I'll tell you what it's like. Suppose I come home one night and I get home at 3 a.m. and my wife says, "Where have you been?" I said, "Oh, well, I was at work. I had to work late, so I came home after work." But in fact, what happened is I went to the bar and got completely drunk with friends and then ended up at somebody else's house and we had a party and then I came home at 3. So that's what really happened. So like one source says that Bart went out and went to a party and and then came home at 3. The other source says Bart went to work and then came home. So are you telling me that story is correct, that Bart came home right after work? Luke says that they did these things, then they went. He didn't say some years later they went. And so if you're going to think they went some years later, well, what would make you think that? In other words, if you just read Luke, what would make you think that? Well, nothing would. Why would anybody say that? Only because they're trying to reconcile it. They're trying to make it account. They're trying to account for Matthew in light of Luke. And okay, fine. So, yeah, okay. Whatever.
Well, Matthew seems to hint that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus had a longer stay in Bethlehem, possibly even 2 years. This might explain why Herod ordered the killing of all the male children in Bethlehem 2 years and under.
What? That's precisely the problem. Wait, okay. If they stayed for 2 years in okay, I'm not understanding what he's saying. Because if they stayed 2 years in Bethlehem, according to Matthew, how did they go right back to Nazareth, according to Luke? And if they're there for 2 years and then they go to Egypt, is he saying that Luke knows this and just doesn't think that part's important to say? I don't know what he's saying.
Or did he say that maybe they hung out for 2 years in Egypt?
No, he's 2 years in Bethlehem because that's when Herod decides to kill every boy 2 years and under in Bethlehem. That suggested the wise men took 2 years to get there. And that means that they're staying in Bethlehem for 2 years. Then they go down to Egypt. Then Herod died. Then they come back to Nazareth. And all that happens in Luke. Apparently, Luke doesn't mention that part. So when Luke says they did the things in the temple, then they went to Nazareth, what he means is, 4 years later, they went to Nazareth. Okay. So when I graduated from high school, I moved to North Carolina. Suppose I say that. Well, if I say that, you normally assume that means I came to North Carolina when I graduated from high school. But no, actually, I first went to Chicago. I spent 10 years in New Jersey, and then I came to North Carolina. So you say, well, it's not actually a contradiction. Okay, it's not a contradiction. Whatever.
So can these two accounts be reconciled? Yeah, and I don't think it's terribly hard to see how. Mary and Joseph travel to Bethlehem. Jesus is born and the shepherds visit. 40 days after Jesus' birth, they go to the temple in Jerusalem to fulfill the law. Then they return to their home in Bethlehem. They meet the Magi. Then, after being warned in a dream about Herod's plot, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus flee to Egypt to escape. Finally, when Herod is dead, they begin to travel back to Judea, to Bethlehem. But after being warned in another dream, they go to Nazareth instead. This series of events is totally consistent with both accounts.
Yeah, I'll say that's how I reconciled it when I was a fundamentalist too. And so you can, if that seems to you the most plausible way to read Luke, that he's skipped 4 or 5 years because he doesn't think it matters, or if you think that that's what Luke is saying, okay. If you take Luke seriously and read him as an account rather than injecting your own ideas into it, which is what he's doing, he's trying to reconcile it with something else rather than reading the text for itself. So you can do that. Of course you can. Yeah.
You specifically said that in order to harmonize these accounts, you need to make something up. Tim objected to that, but then proceeded to do exactly what you said. He made something up. It doesn't matter how common sense he thinks it is. It's making something up.
Yes. It's not what Luke says. It's not what Matthew says. So where do you get the scenario from? Well, you've made it up. So if it's not in either of the sources, and you're saying that's what happened, you're saying the sources agree this happened, even though neither source says it. So how does that work? Well, because you're making it up. You got to invent something that's not in either text in order to make the two of them reconciled.
So if I recall, Mark is the first gospel that was written, and the others are a decade or two after
Mark. So if Mark doesn't mention the virgin birth, how do you think about the absence of evidence is evidence of absence, or it's just he forgot, or or it wasn't important to him?
Yeah, well, it could be. No, right. Yeah, yeah. I don't think that the fact that he doesn't mention it is not a persuasive argument that he didn't know about it. But I would say it is interesting and worth considering. Did he know about it? What makes it a little bit more interesting is that in chapter 2 of Mark, Jesus is teaching. So he's an adult now. He's teaching. He starts out as an adult in Mark. He's teaching these crowds, and he's got these crowds around him, and he's been doing these. He's been casting out demons and things. And it says that his mother and his brothers came to take him out of the public view because they thought he had gone out of his mind.
Interesting.
His mother
Wow.
didn't understand that he was doing miracles, thought he'd gone crazy.
Whoa.
That seems to be unlikely if she knew that he was born of a virgin.
Right.
She was his mother.
So in Mark 3:21, we're told when his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, "He is out of his mind." Now, when that group actually arrives 10 verses later, sure, then the author calls it Jesus' mother and brothers. But technically, his mom isn't called out by name in the earlier verse.
We're actually never told that Mary thought Jesus was crazy. It's not stated in the text that she expressly said that. Rather, this idea is attributed to a group of Jesus' family as a whole.
Well, I don't know. Who do they think was part of his family if his mother wasn't?
I think they want to hang their hat on the fact that if it's not explicitly mentioned. Yeah.
Okay, so they think it's just his brothers who think that he's crazy. Okay, so why do they think he's crazy? Isn't there like some family tradition about this? Oh, by the way, you think he's your full brother? It's just like he's your half brother kind of. His father's not Joseph, it's God. So just so you know. Yeah, that doesn't sound overly. I mean, so it sounds to me within the same chapter identifies who these are, and because there's a few verses later. So I get the point, but it doesn't seem to be a very strong one to me. Who else would this be? So
Skeptics should probably just drop this objection. Saying that Mary thought Jesus was crazy reads too much into the text, and we don't know exactly what the brothers knew, what exactly they were thinking, or even if a miraculous birth would have made a difference to their thoughts in this particular situation.
Mark's entire point is that nobody understood who Jesus was. You find this in Mark. You don't get it in the other Gospels, somewhat in Matthew, not as much. Luke, no. John, definitely no. In the same way. But Mark's whole point, nobody gets who Jesus is. His family doesn't get him. His disciples don't get him. His townspeople don't get him. The Jewish leaders don't get him. And the only one who understands that Jesus has to die for the sins of the world is the centurion at the very end. And so the Roman pagan. And so this is part of Mark's whole motif. So the point is, and then when the mother shows up a few verses later, he rejects her. Your mother and brothers are here to, and these are my mother and brothers and sisters, those who listen to the word. Which means that his mother and brothers are not listening to his words.
So is that more consistent with the birth narrative evolving and becoming legend after Mark wrote, or is it perhaps just something Mark ignored?
Well, I don't think those are the only two options. I mean, it may be that, these authors are living in different parts of the world writing their accounts. And it may well be that in Mark's community, they simply hadn't heard of a virgin birth story yet. So it's not that he's necessarily ignoring it. I don't know what Mark would have done if he had known it. I don't think he's ignoring it or rejecting it. He may never have heard it. And it doesn't have to mean that it's because he's writing earlier. He might be, there are all sorts of stories that float around in one community, but not another community at the same time. And so it's just, I don't think for one reason or another, he just hasn't heard it probably.
Okay.
And so it's not just that it's not mentioned. It's like there are other things that make you think, it doesn't sound like he knows about it. And in the Gospel of John, also there's something kind of like that. It's different, but it's in the Gospel of John. Jesus, there's no mention of the virgin birth, the Gospel of John at all. But at one point, Jesus' enemies are upset with him about something, and they're having an argument, and they're trying to kind of dig it in. They use this ad hominem argument, that's irrelevant to the point, but like it's kind of take a dig at him personally, and they say, we were not born illegitimately. Yeah.
Interesting.
We weren't born out of wedlock, in other words. And it's like, what does that suggest about what they think?
There are other rumors, that Jesus' mother, in fact, got pregnant by a Roman soldier, or that there's some kind of thing going on. And maybe John knows about that, but doesn't know about. So anyway, so there are other things. It's not just the absence of evidence. Yeah. So this isn't something I came up with. None of these things are. I mean, these are things that kind of scholars generally say. And I actually hadn't noticed that for years, that thing in John, until I read some scholars who were pointing it out, that when they say, well, we weren't born of adultery, or however they put it, we weren't born of fornication, I guess they put it, that might suggest, because it kind of comes out of the blue, like when you read it, there hasn't been anything about fornication before this, and all of a sudden, they're just attacking Jesus, and they're like upset that he's claiming authority, and they say, well, we weren't born of fornication. And so some scholars have pointed out, well, maybe what that means is that John knows that there are unusual stories about Jesus' birth, and that his mother may have given birth out of wedlock. People have often wondered if the virgin birth stories themselves, that are found only in Matthew and Luke, whether those are trying to cover up the fact that he was actually born out of wedlock, and that there were stories about he had this unusual birth and it's kind of weird. And it's, no, that's right, Joseph wasn't the father, but it's because he was born of a virgin. And so there might have been these stories floating around. And some people suggest that this thing in John is reflecting the same thing. John doesn't have a virgin birth story, but it may be that within his community, it was known that there were these strange stories about Jesus' birth.
Ehrman is referring to John 8:41, which reads, "And Jesus said, 'You are indeed doing what your father does.' They," his Jewish opponents, responded, "We are not illegitimate children. We have one father, God himself." So is Ehrman correct? To understand what's going on here, we need to examine the surrounding passages. I'll be paraphrasing a bit, but I encourage you all to read John 8 for yourselves. This is when they assert that God is their father and they're not illegitimate, implying Jesus was illegitimate. Jesus then pulls off the gloves and says that their father is Satan. He does this because they refuse to believe him and are trying to destroy him. Then Jesus' opponents try but fail to pull the Uno reverse card. They ask, "Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" Because in the context of John, Jesus was making some very bold claims about his self-identity, his enemies were calling him demon-possessed and a crazy Samaritan idolater. To them, Jesus is mixing Jewish ideas with pagan ones, just as the Samaritans do. Their worship, on the other hand, was of the pure kind. They were the true sons of Abraham and of the offspring of God. So what we have here is that Dr. Ehrman is just simply ignoring the context of the passage.
My only point is that people were saying that Jesus was born illegitimately. People were also saying that he's possessed of demons. And people might be saying that he was a Samaritan. I mean, the Samaritans do come off very well in some of Jesus' sayings. And so you could see that there would be cover-ups for all of those things. And so the idea that he's casting out demons, not by the power of Beelzebub, by the power of God, would be defending against the idea that he's possessed by demons. The story about the Good Samaritan and the conversation with the woman from Samaria in John chapter 4 might be covering up the claims that he himself was a Samaritan. So I'm not saying that he really was a Samaritan, that he really was, born illegitimately, and that he really was possessed by demons. I'm saying that these are the stories that are floating around about him, and that it's worth thinking about why there are stories like that floating around.
So what do you think is the strongest conclusion we could make from that, or hypothesis we could pose from that about the birth narrative and the author of John's knowledge about it?
Well, I doubt if the author of John has knowledge of a virgin birth. My guess is that if he knew that there was a virgin birth story, he would have included it. There'd be no reason not to that I can think of. I think it's likely that it shows that people did know that there were unusual circumstances about Jesus' birth. And that would, it doesn't prove that Jesus is born out of wedlock. I'm not saying that it proves that, but it would suggest that people were saying that. And so I think that's a likely scenario. And I think it's likely that virgin birth stories in some ways are related to that same scenario. So that Matthew's related in one way about the virgin birth, Luke in a different way with a different virgin birth story, John in a different way. And so that these stories are floating around. And of course, in later, I guess we haven't pointed this out, so it's not of course, but in later polemics against Christians, there are pagan opponents who claim that he was born illegitimately. And so there are these stories that were floating around. We know they were because people use them against Christians.
So don't let Bart Ehrman spoil your Christmas.
Too late. Bart's upcoming course is all about dark Christmas.
Now I have a machine gun. Ho, ho, ho. I hate you!
If the Yule Cat spots anyone with frayed or torn clothing, he eats them.
I just wanted Christmas to be like it used to be.
Yeah, it's none of the above. My course is about how dark Christmas is actually in the gospel narratives themselves, and that these stories have a dark side that I never really paid much attention to. I mean, I knew the stories, obviously, but I never really thought deeply about how dark they can be. Because for those of us who grew up celebrating Christmas and kind of found it a happy time, which I did, it was a time of celebration and joy and happiness and peace and all that. And so you'd read these stories and you wouldn't really pay attention to some of the details that really are troubling. And I mean, the one that kind of got me going, this is just like this last year. I just started thinking deeply about it. When Jesus is born in Bethlehem, Herod finds out that the king of the Jews has been born in Bethlehem and he doesn't want the competition. So he sends out the troops and he kills every boy 2 years and under in Bethlehem, the slaughter of the innocents, it's called. Well, we all get that and we're so happy that Jesus escaped with his mom and dad and they got down to Egypt before Herod could take him out. And it's kind of like this story, what happens when the airplane wrecks and, 367 people die and 3 people escape. And one of the people comes on TV and says, "Oh, God saved me. I'm so, God was on my side." But you hear that and you think, God, what are you thinking? All these people just died. But we don't think about that in the Christmas story. All of these children these innocent babies died and their parents' lives are ruined so that the Son of God could come into the world. And you think, wow, that's dark. And so when I'm going to be talking about it, I'm not going to be trashing it and saying, God, this is ridiculous. I'm going to be actually asking, is there some kind of deeper profundity to this? Because it's precisely because these stories are not historical that it's an interesting question. In other words, if they're just recounting the things that happen, then there's no theme here. There's no literary motif. There's no theology here. It's just like, this is what happened. But if somebody's coming up with this as a story, they're trying to say something. And what are they saying about the relationship of salvation and suffering? Because what we usually think is that suffering, leads to God saves us out of our suffering. But in this story, salvation creates suffering for people. And I started realizing throughout the Bible, salvation requires suffering and often creates suffering. Wow. So what does that mean? And so I think it leads to a more profound understanding of what's going on in these gospel stories than just, the happy-go-lucky, oh, that's nice. Okay, we're saved now. Let's give each other presents.
Half of my audience thinks the nativity story is real, and the other half, not so much. And those who think it's all legend will get something out of it too.
So whether it's literary or historical, it's the same point. Because if it's historical, if it's something that actually happened, it would mean that God really does require suffering for salvation to come, that the salvation that God brings really does create suffering. And that's consistent with the entire Bible. When Jesus says that I didn't come to bring peace but a sword, people overlook that. But if it's historically true, that's what's going on, that it means that the coming of Jesus is not simply to resolve the problems of the world. It creates problems in the world. And if you understand that, then you have a different understanding of God, not just as somebody who is kind of trying to pluck people out of here in order to give them, happy existence, but who's entering into suffering, and it's a suffering world, and participating in the suffering and actually is coming into the world for salvation creates suffering. And so that's a different view of God than people have. So whether it's literary or whether it's historical, that message is the same message.
And for someone coming at it, just someone who's saying, this is all just legend anyway, what does it matter? There'll be something for them as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think it's historical. And I read novels, for example, and I read poetry, and I don't think they really happened. But I find that they give me ways of thinking about the world that deepen my life and help me think more seriously about what's going on all around us. In this right now, we are in a period of real suffering, and, some of us think it's going to get worse now, and some of us think it's going to get better. So, whichever side you're on, you need some ways to deal with this and think about it rather than putting your head in the sand and pretend it's not happening. And throughout the world, there's enormous suffering. And these stories, in some ways, are being directed toward dealing with that from a theological point of view. What is the meaning of this suffering, and how can God be involved in it? And so even though I don't believe that there's a God who's involved in it, it allows me to think more deeply about what's the meaning of all this, and can anything good come out of it? And so these stories are ways of showing that, yes, something good can come out of it, but the good requires more suffering.
Oh, no. Yikes.
Yikes. Yeah.
All right. Well, Merry Christmas to you, Bart. I assume you... I assume you celebrate still?
Oh, yeah, I love Christmas. I do. I love Christmas. And what can I say? And so this dark side isn't my going after Christmas at all. It's to kind of deepen what it's all about. And so, yes, I do celebrate Christmas.
So you're not part of the war on Christmas officially that we hear so much about.
Well, I'm against all the materialism. And
okay.
Well, of course. I mean, but on the other hand, it keeps the economy going. So it actually also does some good. But, it just becomes such a crass thing. And so I don't like that. But I like a lot of what it celebrates, which is, for me, it means being with family and friends and having good cheer and trying to think of better things, and good could come out of evil. So I like that. I like good coming out of evil.
And, while we're at it, why not give the gift of a Bart Ehrman course to your loved ones for Christmas? That seems like a perfect thing.
Well, there you go.
All right. Thanks so much, Bart.
Okay. Thank you.